Welcome to another Trauma Talk radio segment. I am here today with Mr. David. And my question for you is, what is trauma to you and how does it impact humanity?
Yeah, trauma to me is something that is an ongoing issue that has impacted the world from the very beginning. But the way that it is distributed and the way that it manifests itself today, and how it has from the beginning of time, how has trauma? Because if you think about it, when the Neanderthals and all the folks that were living, and throughout the world, in the prehistoric stage, right? If an animal came and they attacked them but they escaped, that was a traumatic experience, right? But now we got to slice that, and how does that trauma outside of that isn't, I would say, natural, hunting, fishing, gathering, all that kind of stuff. If we move into power and privilege, now we're going into a different kind of trauma that is imposed trauma and created and imposed, right? From a different perspective, right? So I'm going to speak to that perspective, right? Because if we think about intergenerational trauma and the trauma that has been perpetrated among Indian people and the Black community, Black people around the world, we're talking definitely a different kind of imposed trauma that gets manifested intergenerationally, both in the African American community and the Native community, Latino community. And I say Latino community because one, I'm both, right? But and I've seen it where indigenous people from Mexico, Central and South America, North American indigenous people are still going through that intergenerational trauma and still being imposed that trauma by power and privilege, right? So on top of that, then if we go back to the time of 1492 and we start unpacking that, then we could say that imposed trauma also looking at the Black community, right? That all the trauma that was imposed, right, from the slave kidnapping. I'm not going to say slave trade because trade is commerce. We're human beings, so we even have to change the type of language that we use in speaking to trauma. So the human trafficking that occurred, right, has impacted both communities, the indigenous community and the Black community, right? So now we're dealing with the trauma of genocide. We're talking the traumas that have been inflicted upon Native women, Black women, during the human trafficking time, and still to this day. If you look at human trafficking around the world, it's still taking place, right? Among, guess who? Those that are considered non-human, right? To a certain degree, I would say actually to this day, both people of color around the world are still not considered human. That's why I even talk about this and say that even the term Black Lives Matter, right? That name that came surface from the community, right, is a testament to the fact that those that are in power still see us as non-human. See, why do we have to proclaim that Black Lives Matter? Because they don't matter. Why don't they matter? Because we're still looked at as non-human, right? Non-human beings, right? That you can obliterate, kidnap, and kill, right? So for me, for me, those are some of the ways in which trauma has really impacted humanity, right? And I would say this, that even the people that are imposing that trauma, they themselves are going to suffer from the traumatic impact of imposing trauma, right? So it goes both ways, right? Those that receive and those that perpetrate, right? So then what happens? Then The that intergenerational trauma gets handed down generation over generation, and we get what we are seeing now, where the full blown oppression around the world for economic purposes, right? For very selfish economic purposes, and those that individuals that are non-human, doesn't matter. They're non-human anyways. So why not go in there, either perpetrate genocide, push them out, go get the land, and then mine it for economic reasons, right? So again, moving people out, committing genocide, those are the traumatic experiences that we're still seeing today. More at a grassroots level among our young people today, the whole issue of violence, right, among our young people, right? A lot of them are trying to be part of something larger than themselves, and sometimes, and and to a large extent, feed themselves, right? So, if there's nothing in our local communities where there's economic opportunities for them to thrive, who am I to judge that they're going to go and have to sling something here or something there in order to make a living? And why is that? Uh, are they going to hire brown and black young people to come in certain jobs? No. And then they turn around and blame us for not living, picking ourselves up from our bootstraps. We don't even have boots. We don't even have sandals, right? So that again, all that comes from and originates for me in the research that I've been doing, 1492. The moment that Christopher Columbus put his first boot imprint in the sand in the Caribbean, not only did the trauma begin, but also our resistance, right? So Native resistance, Black resistance has been taking place, right? So it's not like we're going to lay back and not do anything, right? A lot of those that were plantation owners, when they used to hear the call to prayer from the black slaves, were like made themselves trip, like what is going on, right? That's part of our indigenous resistance. I say indigenous in terms of both black and brown and red, right? So again, this intergenerational trauma and trauma to humanity, there's different kinds of trauma, but there's also this other kind of trauma which is imposed and gets manifested on a continuum basis through the social structures and political structures and governmental structures that exist today, right? Going to the bank and having a teller look at somebody and judging them, and not, accusing them of bringing in a false a check that may not, they feel that is not a real check, right? Is already part of it. That's an institutional trauma effect, right? The fact that occurred is traumatic for that young man or woman, right? To have that notion be placed upon them, right? And so what happens then, right? They go home disappointed, shattered, and then guess what? The children that are there listening to the story and maybe feeling, because a lot of our communities, we go by feeling what we feel, our energies, right? And so for a young child to be receiving that energy when the mom or dad comes in with that energy is part of that intergenerational trauma that begins to fester, right? So those are just some of the examples.
Yeah. You said a whole mouthful. My goodness. But I love how you explain that there's trauma that's just a human condition. It's this who we are as human beings. We have these experiences, but then there's that power and privilege trauma that's imposed from one group of people that's imposed on other groups of people, and the complexities of that, and how in our societies that type of trauma has been institutionalized, and how with our experiences with those institutionalized trauma is now become internalized. And so it's really a lot for us to unpack. So I hope that for our viewers that you really stimulated critical thinking and introspective to really reflect upon how are the societal structures of our society, how is that impacting me, and how is that defining me through the lens of trauma rather than freedom, and what are the necessary steps to walk in a different direction. So I believe that that's what you're leaving our viewers with, those questions in a nutshell, to explore.
You did a great job of synthesizing it. This imposed trauma, right? That gets perpetrated over and over again, and the whole going to the bank is just one example, but there's thousands of examples like that, and it's like death by 1,000 cuts. And that's why it's so subtle and sometimes really hard to pinpoint where these traumatic experiences really trigger something in us, and how we begin to try to focus on these traumas. There's too many. Right. So then we got to do
because like you said, we go by how we feel, and it's not only the experience we experience, it's the experiences we experience through others when we're hearing their stories as well. So that's a lot, and this is all happening on a subconscious level. We're not even always completely aware or conscientious of the impact of such trauma. But I believe that your thesis on it really helped open our minds to the reality of it, where we can start to pinpoint, even if our listeners could only like one particular trauma just came up right now as they're listening to you, at least that's somewhere to start. Let me at least start unpacking this one, and then see where to go next, and that's going to take them on the path of healing.
I'll give you another quick one. When somebody's about to approach me at a gas station to try to ask for directions, but then they end up asking directions from somebody not of color, and I see that there's more confidence in the directions that this other person is going to give other than me, it's going to create a feeling and a small traumatic experience, right? So the traumatic experience is not just trauma that is overwhelmingly violent. It's these small, tiny traumatic experiences that end up accumulating over a period of time, where we start doubting ourselves, right? And it really recreates self-hate, self-doubt, lack of confidence, right? And so we have to start looking at these microaggressions, right, that occur, and saying, where is this coming from? And most importantly, how do I mitigate the microaggressions, right? How do I mitigate that?
Absolutely, and I love it. So we're gonna close out, because what you just hit on is our definition for trauma. And trauma is anything that violates your internal sense of safety, security, and stability. So like you said, it doesn't have to be a catastrophic event. It's those tiny experiences, those tiny interactions that can accumulate and create an internal sense of unsafety, insecurity, and emotional, mentally, and spiritually unstableness. So thank you so much. Oh my goodness, David, this was good. We got to do like a longer one. Oh, we got to do a picture. Go ahead.